Hi everyone, my name's Wendy, and today with us we have Dr. Tarek Walker talking about Black History Month as our little celebration for the month. And I'm just gonna send it off to him with a nice quick introduction.
Thank you, Wendy and Kat. Again, my name is Tarek Walker. I'm a physician scientist that does health disparities research, particularly within the sort of the genetics realm, but I've been expanding my wings a little bit and as I've been doing some collaborative work with Dr. Keith Neves in the bioengineering department as well. Um, and I've been really excited over the last year or so since I've been kind of collaborating with Keith to have had some opportunities to share some of my experiences with fellow bioengineering faculty and students, not only as it relates to science, but as it relates to diversity in science, inclusivity, pipeline programs, and that sort of thing. So I was really flattered and honored for um, Wendy and Sean to have suggested that I maybe give a little talk on Black History Month. So I'll just dive in and we'll just kind of keep it informal. So I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. Uh, and you guys let me know if you can see my screen okay. Can everyone see my screen? Okay. So so I had a wonderful opportunity to talk to the bioengineering group earlier in the year around sort of my experiences in science and kind of how I got introduced to science and how science has afforded me a ton of opportunities, not only um, as a health professional, but as an African American health professional. And that has continued, obviously, but I wanted to share a little bit about the role and the value of underrepresented minorities, and particularly since I'm Black American, Blacks in science and in the health sciences in general. And I titled my talk Blacks in Science, but not only during Black History Month, because I do think that there is this tendency to sort of delineate between the roles as well as the accomplishments of certain underrepresented folks um, throughout the year when it's not February, but then sort of spotlighting and highlighting some of those achievements and accomplishments during Black History Month. And I believe that they're all kind of intertwined. So let's begin. So, um, when we think about American history in general, when we say that use that term American history, so many names kind of immediately come to mind. Names that are kind of household names, names that we might not be familiar with if it wasn't for our primary school teachers and our high school teachers, ingraining and embedding these names into our sort of daily educational path. Um, and and I think we have just sort of an intrinsic tendency to separate our history makers along the lines of race quite often. And I think that that's a mistake, and I also think that it's divisive, and I think it creates a real subconscious or even conscious mindset particularly amongst underrepresented students, to think, oh, well, there's this important history over here, and then there's sort of this secondary history over here. And I think that um, it's important as we talk about history to not only understand its value, but to intertwine history um, across all races and ethnicities. And as you kind of scan this list, another thing that we do, um, unfortunately, is we have a tendency to kind of glamorize certain people in history, whether they actually did what we claim they did historically or not. And I think that the generation that follows mine, I think, certainly does a better job in really asking really important questions so that we, as we pass down history over the years and we continue to retell our history, that we do a good job of telling it accurately. And you know, a good example of this is Christopher Columbus, who's at the top of this list. When I was in elementary school, he was deemed to be perhaps one of the most heroic uh, American history figures in our society. And the good news is that as each subsequent generation follows me, uh, that asks questions, that gathers more and more information, and as more information is revealed, we learn a lot of the truths around many of the mistruths around history. So history is important because obviously what happens in the past helps us to learn and frame and understand how our future can look. And so it's not only important from an academic perspective, but when I think about history, not just American history, but all history, um, I kind of think about mentoring. So what I mean by that is if a student um, is really interested in bioengineering, for example, but does not have any historical role models that they can look to say, oh, well, this person did this, this, and this when they were an undergraduate student. Maybe I can do that. Or this person did this, this, and this successfully as a graduate student. Maybe I can follow in that same historical pathway. If one does not have those kind of historical models to look to, then it can be very discouraging as we try to mentor each generation of student and ultimately each generation of professional. So history isn't important just as an exercise, an academic exercise, but it's important in laying a foundation for how we frame certain options for people as they move forward. And so, how we remember and how we retell our history is critical to that psychological understanding and that psychological um, outlook for many young people and professionals. So, you know, just to my point, you know, we have a tendency to really do a wonderful job here in America of glamorizing certain historical figures that we can deem to be important and significant in our country's history. We name street signs after them. We name highways after them. And then as we learn more and more about some of our historical figures that we have glamorized, um, we try in many instances, in many instances we don't. But in the good news is, I think we're within an information age right now where um, people want the truth, and so it's not only significant, but it's important that as we retell history, we correct the errors of our past in that historical retelling that happens from generation to generation. But what's kind of interesting, if you look at this sign in the lower left-hand corner, of all the ways in which we symbolically honor people who we um, portray as being historical figures, in many respects, particularly here in America, sometimes it doesn't even matter whether that individual played a real meaningful and significant role in our history. I mean, um, oftentimes simply holding a position guarantees someone a historical place in our history. So um, I will allow future generations to be the gatekeepers for how we identify and reward historical figures, but I think it's always important how we retell history and how we document history in a way that's accurate. Now, I remember when I was growing up, in terms of thinking about Black history again, it was always separated from, I guess, more mainstream white American history. It was always kind of put in a separate category, which always made me feel a certain way about Black History Month. On the one hand, Black History Month is unique and special in the sense that we as a society are carving out very intentionally some time during the calendar year to honor those folks that have made a very significant impact in our society, and particularly to honor a segment of our society that was here at the very beginning when America was being formed. And America was not even America, but it was just undeveloped land and overgrown brush, and then that had to be cultivated and developed over a series of centuries. So it's excellent in that sense. But on the other hand, I always felt like African American history or Black history was always compartmentalized into certain categories, like slave. It always seemed to start with slavery and Jim Crow, with mention of a lot of the same Black historical figures that have permeated our history books, with very little mention of too many other folks. And as you look at this list, you know, we see a lot of the sort of the major characters in Black history retelling. Many of them are, again, linked to slavery and early 17th and 18th century. Many of them are civil rights activists, which is important. Many of them are athletes or entertainers, which is a very large part of how Black Americans identify themselves with respect to many of their, how we admire and revere our historical figures. But then if you look kind of more recently, you know, our more recent historical figures tend to encompass, again, like kind of more pop types of folks, Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, even their children get a lot of run during Black History Month. And I think it's important that as we share and discuss Black History Month, that we don't sort of get too lazy and just kind of regurgitate a lot of the same figures. Yes, there are many important figures that will always be linked to the significance of Black History Month, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, naturally, but there's a whole world of history that I think a lot of educators don't even tap into because they're so accustomed to focusing on certain sort of more glamorized folks within Black history. So I used this slide in a previous talk that I gave because I think it's important. Again, it speaks to history. I feel like history and mentoring are so intertwined. And so when we talk about Black history, I think every Black American, when they think about their history, they think not only about their culture, their historical culture, but they think about their own personal history. And my personal history involves growing up in a very stable and supportive and loving African American family. I grew up in a community that was diverse. I grew up with both parents in the household who were very active and engaged in my personal development and my academic and professional development. And so my history, even within Black history, is rather unique because, as we all know, you know, Black Americans are not a monolith, and that my experience is very different than many other Black Americans who have grown up here in America as a function of systemic racism and a lot of policies that were put in place centuries ago that still exist today. So history, again, can not only can frame an entire group and an entire culture, but it can frame an individual within that culture. And that's why it's important to know our history. And so, again, my father, for example, played a very critical role in my history. Not only was he um, an amazing presence in my life as a parent, but he was the first person, along with my mother, to introduce me to activism. So, as you can see here in the upper right hand corner, this is actually me, I think around the age of 10 or 11, participating in my very first um, March on Washington, or I guess it was a simulation of the March on Washington that is commemorated every year on Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday holiday. And this is my sister to the right of me. And um, again, this is just to give you an example of how one's personal history can frame their career and their long-term projected history. And this is me in the middle. This is not these are not pictures to show, you know, how cute I was as a kid. But if you look closely at my hair, my father had my hair grown out like in an afro. It was like an expression of my culture and me learning to be proud of my physical features as well as my intellect and my abilities. So it's no coincidence that when one comes from a historical place that's positive, that one can also have and typically does have positive outcomes as a result of that. Another reason again why history is important. So my father was actually the first one to introduce me to political activism, which is a really huge part of how we retell Black American history. Again, that his positive history allowed me to identify what I wanted to pursue as an undergraduate student, which was science, which I was able to do in a lab setting, and then go on to pursue medicine and more research as a medical student. And again, um, all of these images that I'm sharing are representations of history, my short lifetime history, but history nevertheless. And so I think it's very reasonable to say that if I did not come from a very solid historical base, I never would have made it to Johns Hopkins Medical School and Public Health School. Again, it goes back to history. So um, when I was at Johns Hopkins Medical School, I remember as a first year medical student walking from the doctor's lounge, which was also a shared lounge where medical students could go and kind of hang out and um, decompress after a long exam or finals and get coffee for free, which was nice. And I remember there was this portrait. This colored portrait here is what stood in the hallway as right before you got to the doctor's lounge, and it was a very small portrait. And I remember asking someone. Well, I remember trying to get a close up view of it the first time. It kind of struck my eye. Johns Hopkins, when I was there, and since I have left, is not the most diverse campus on the East Coast. And so whenever I saw a Black portrait, I thought, wow, that this person must be very significant. And when it caught my eye, I moved closer to see, you know, if it was captioned and, you know, who this individual was, because I had never heard of him or seen this image before. And when I got closer, I saw the caption and it just said Vivian Thomas on the bottom. That's it. No description of who he was, why he was significant, why he had his own colored portrait at Johns Hopkins Hospital, which is very rare. This is an image of him at the top working in the lab. But I came to discover later, oops, sorry, that Vivian Thomas, was actually a lab assistant in the 1930s and 40s, or maybe 20s and 30s. He was a lab assistant at Johns Hopkins, and he never graduated from college. He never went to grad school. However, he perfected certain surgical techniques in a laboratory to such a high level that these other two white physicians, I don't know if you can see them in the corner, Dr. Henry Blaylock and Dr. Helen Taussig, who are internationally known cardiac surgeons, he perfected a surgery that these two individuals ended up using to save lives in the operating room. And he's self-taught. He learned these surgeries purely on his own in the lab, working on pigs in pig lab surgery. And the rumor has it, or at least the way the story has been told, is that when these two operated, they always had to have him in the OR with them. Dr. Blaylock has been credited for inventing certain cardiac bypass surgeries, and Dr. Taussig is a pioneer in cardiac surgery when it comes to the development and the perfection of surgical techniques that have gone on to save what are called blue babies. I want you all to Google that when this talk is over. And he was kind of their right hand in the OR. He was not simply handing them whatever surgical device they needed. He was actually guiding them through these surgeries. And because of his incredible techniques, he was awarded an honorary degree from Johns Hopkins. He's the first African American to receive an honorary degree from Johns Hopkins Medical School. But the sad and ironic part is he was never allowed to get his undergraduate degree or his graduate degree. So I say all this to say that our history and that history motivated me when I was at Johns Hopkins. I know this might sound crazy what I'm about to say, but when I was having challenging times as a student, a medical student or a public health student, I would try to channel this man's energy and say, hey, listen, this guy did it. Maybe I can do it too. And so that kind of speaks to the importance of knowing who and what came before you can often be very helpful in guiding you down the road. I don't know if any of you all have heard of Dr. Levi Watkins, but I was very blessed to have had this gentleman as a mentor when I was at Johns Hopkins. He has since passed away. I believe he passed away about 6 or 7 years ago. But he also was a pioneer in cardiac surgery. He was responsible for actually perfecting the surgical implant of defibrillators in patients at Johns Hopkins. And he was the first African American to graduate from Vanderbilt Medical School. And he actually also trained under Vivian Thomas while he was there. This was kind of toward the tail end of Vivian Thomas's career. And then he actually went on to become the chief of cardiac surgery at Johns Hopkins. And so, and here's how incredible his history is. In addition to being a pioneer in cardiac surgery at that time, the #1 hospital in the world, he also was a very, very active civil rights activist. So he marched with Martin Luther King, and I don't mean he went to Washington, D.C. when Martin Luther King spoke, he was actually marching side by side with him in the 1960s while he was a physician. And he continued to be very active in civil rights throughout his career. And so and then finally, when I interviewed for medical school, he was actually one of the gentlemen that interviewed me. He was one of the last physicians to interview me. And I remember knowing a lot about him already. He's from Tennessee. My father's from Tennessee, so my father actually schooled me quite a bit on this man before I even got to medical school. So I knew so much about him and his history. And I remember during my interview, I think it was actually the last interview I had for the day, he said to me, Tarek, if I go to the admissions board and tell them that you are coming here, will you come? And I said, yes. And he said, okay, that's all I need to hear. That was our interview. So I say that to say that, again, history, both contemporary history and history from centuries ago, can frame how we dictate our path in life. And what he taught me was less about medicine, but more about how one can be socially minded, um, how one can be an activist, and how one can advocate for the oppressed and still be a very successful health professional, which he was. Okay, here's more personal history that I want to share with you. So this, I don't know if this is a very old clipping. I don't know if you can see it in the lower left-hand corner, but this clipping from the Spelman College Spotlight, and Spelman College is what's called an HBCU, or Historically Black College and University in Atlanta, Georgia. It's one of the oldest HBCUs in existence. It's still there. It's an all-women's college, where my mother went to college. And this is my mother here, Betty Stevens, elected president. So she was SGA president of her college her senior year. And I don't say this to brag. I say this to say that this is another example of not only a role model in my life, but someone who has contributed to America's history. And the way she did that was when she was at Spelman College, she, along with her junior and senior class, were the first class to participate in the sit-in movement during the early 1960s. So in 1963, she led a group of college classmates, all women, to sit in downtown Atlanta, Georgia, in restaurants and in movie theaters and in cafes that were not welcome to Black people. She subsequently, along with many of her classmates, got arrested. And a lot of this is documented in these two books, Howard Zinn's Southern Diary and Undaunted by the Fight. And it's kind of hard to see here, but this is a picture of her and her classmates in a jail cell, or waiting to be put into a jail cell. This is her in the center of the book, sitting next to Marian Wright Edelman, who is the head of the Children's Defense Fund. I want you all to Google that also when you're done. Marian Wright Edelman, they're still very good friends to this day. And so I learned about this years and years and years later when I was in high school. My mother didn't even share any of this history with me. I had to read about my mother because she's a humble woman. And, just again, asked her how she was able to do this as a college student, how she was able to be elected school president. My mother eventually went on to go to Harvard Law School, where she was very successful as a law student and still able to do all that, again, while being active in civil rights. And, she shared many stories with me about how her family members and her college administration was not supportive of her doing this and was not excited about her classmates doing this. But she wanted to do what was right. And so again, this history that I'm sharing with you is not only part of American history, but it's part of my personal history. And I cannot separate myself, obviously, from my mother's history, my father's history, because they had a very significant impact in raising me. And this is her with Dr. Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn, I want you all to Google. Incredible, incredible American who has an incredible history in terms of civil rights, leadership, and education. He's written many books. He's been on many talk shows. If you YouTube him, you will find some really incredible gems. And he and my mother, and I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with Alice Walker. Alice Walker is a world-renowned poet and author who was good friends with my mother. They were classmates at Spelman College. And all three of them, well, Dr. Zinn passed away a couple years ago, but all three of them were very close, even beyond college. Again, three incredible American history figures on this slide. Not to brag, but just saying. So a couple years ago, my mother was actually invited to NYU with Dr. Robert Cohen, who wrote this book on Howard Zinn, to talk a bit about her experiences during the sit-in movement. And here in the center is a picture of my mom and dad when they were in college. So my mother went to Spelman College, all Black, all female college. My father attended Morehouse College, which is the HBCU right down the street from Spelman College. All Black, all male college. So that's how they met. They were my father was also an SGA president when he was at Morehouse College. And so, you know, sometimes leadership attracts leadership. So that's how they met. And it's no coincidence either that my father, when he was a high school student, and if you look in this upper right-hand photo, this is him at a downtown Chattanooga, Tennessee cafe, sitting in a segregated cafe. He and these are all high school classmates of him, were not allowed to be there. And there's a quote from him in this picture, or it's actually a quote about him by one of his classmates. It says, "I was too young and too stupid to be scared. We did this because it was just something we had to do at this time." Vernon Jones on February 19th, Howard High School class, President Paul Walker. So again, like this is my father as a senior in high school, not even in college yet, engaging in very risky, very challenging civil rights efforts. This is him being invited 50 years later to come and talk about the anniversary of that sit-in. I guess it's now been 51 years. My math is correct. No, 61 years since that sit-in. As you can see, there were hoses that were turned on the students that participated in this sit-in. And again, it was a tremendous gamble that he took as a high school student. And again, how this history framed America. This was the very first sit-in in Chattanooga, Tennessee ever, organized by high school students. Keep that in mind. How this history impacted America is significant, but it's also significant in terms of how it impacted me and my siblings, knowing that my father as a high school student was taking these risks. It's no coincidence that his early work and his efforts framed my efforts and ultimate outcome. It's all related. So this is how I got into a laboratory many years later doing ethnic minority research and health disparities research. It goes back to this individual and this person's efforts, and it goes back to this individual's efforts and hard work, all related. And what this does as we talk about Black history is it frames it in a way where we recognize that, as I just shared with you, all of those efforts were taking place 40, 50, 60 plus years ago, and we're still in this era in 2021 where there are still these huge disparities that exist, particularly in my area of research, that we still have a lot of very hard work to do in overcoming. And so the value of talking about Black history every February, and hopefully we'll get to a place where it's integrated into the fabric of our history courses, where we talk about it every day. But the value in talking about Black history for those who say, well, why do we even need a Black History Month? We've come so far, we have a Barack Obama and all, is that there's still a lot of disparity that exists here in America, even at the level of science, which is supposed to be an objective field. You know, when one walks into a courtroom, for example, and stands in front of a judge, and a person has been accused of a crime, that person's race, that person's gender, that person's socioeconomic status can have a real impact on whether or not that person is going to be evaluated fairly by either a judge or by a jury. Science is not supposed to be subjective. Science is supposed to be objective. If you measure out the exact amount of a chemical and mix it with the exact amount of another chemical because of certain laws of science, a certain reaction is supposed to take place every single time if you do it right. So the fact that we see disparities still existing in areas of our American society that are supposed to be stripped of subjectivity, the fact that we still see those is very disconcerting. But what it does show me is that there is value in still retelling our history, and it validates why we need to keep telling these stories. So this, again, this is, fast forward to me now. This is me and my family. This is me at the I guess they called it Fight for Science March right here in Colorado, downtown Colorado. It was about a year ago, I believe, or a year and a half ago. Again, just confirming that we have so much work to do, and if we follow our history, then other generations like these two girls here will also continue the traditions that were laid and born before us in previous generations. Again, just another important example of why it's so critical to know and to understand and to follow our history. Right now, I don't know if any of you all are kind of keeping an eye on this or being very vigilant about this, but if you look on social media, you will see that there is a really powerful integration going on right now. I'm so jealous of all of you on this call, because this movement that is taking place, where people are integrating social justice within science, not within, political science, but within science, bioengineering, chemistry, physics. People are actually taking notice now, and they're saying, hey, listen, we have to start doing things differently than we did 10, 20, 30 years ago. We have to recognize that there are injustices, even in science, even in STEM careers. And I think that the value again of knowing one's history allows these kind of movements to not only, take place and not just become sort of temporary movements, but they become embedded and ingrained in the way we talk about science and the way we talk about who we hire to work in a lab, or how the way we talk about who to be the chairperson of a department. These kind of critical dialogues are happening, and they're happening only because we keep our history in front of us. Um, I just wanted to kind of close with this. When I was uh, in high school, uh, Doug Williams was, and I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this. I grew up in the D.C. area. I grew up a Redskins fan. I don't like to use that term. Fortunately, they changed the name, which I'm so excited about. Um, but I grew up calling our Washington football team the Redskins, and I grew up supporting them. And this is me in this corner cheering on this black quarterback, number 17, in the middle, and I was at this game against the Minnesota Vikings. And I got excited because he threw a touchdown pass with about a minute and a half left in the game that kind of sealed our trip as a football team to the Super Bowl that year. And when we went to the Super Bowl, not only did Doug Williams uh, win the game, but he was the most valuable player of that game. He broke all kinds of Super Bowl records that game. And what that did was it energized so many people in the DC area who were African American, and even nationally. I heard someone recently say on a podcast I was listening to say, well, if there was no Doug Williams, he was the first black quarterback to win a Super Bowl. If there was no Doug Williams, there might not have been a Barack Obama. And I really had to think about that. That sounded like such a stretch. But I think the reason that that person opined that way is because, we look at quarterbacks who play football, for those of us that follow football, we look at the quarterback position as a position of leadership and as a position of command and as a position of sort of uh, higher intellect than maybe a defensive lineman who is only looking to knock someone's head off, And so because so many black quarterbacks had been historically denied not only even an opportunity to play in the National Football League, nonetheless lead a team to a Super Bowl and in such an astonishing fashion, but I think so many people learned from him that there's 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 something that we might have already known subconsciously, but we just had not seen it before. There is when blacks are given opportunities to lead, they can succeed just like any other group. But until you see it, it doesn't always manifest itself as a reality. And now, we kind of take for granted that there are black quarterbacks in football and that there are not only excellent leaders, but they are winners. Well, again, what makes Black History Month so necessary is that we still have racism within sports. Sports, again, like science, is supposed to be purely objective, not subjective. If you can run faster than this guy, you should be in lane one, and that guy should be in lane two. If you can quarterback as well as this other person, you should be the starter. And so again, I have this image of Tom Brady here. I don't know how many of you all follow football and Tom Brady. This is a picture of him with the Patriots. He's no longer with the Patriots, but he was interviewed by Howard Stern after he won his 6th Super Bowl. And Howard Stern asked him on his show, he said, I want to ask you an honest question. You know, you're the quarterback of the Patriots. You're the face of that team. You're, you know, a sports icon. Everybody knows who you are, and you are leading a group of 50 to 60 athletes every week. Most of them are Black. How do you kind of deal with that psychologically? And Tom Brady said to Howard Stern, well, I don't really see race when I am playing with my teammates. They're just my teammates. And that was a really eye-opening answer for Howard Stern because, you know, we all see race. You know, I understand, I think I understand what Tom Brady was trying to say, but if you're Doug Williams in 1988, where you're being interviewed right before you're about to play the biggest game of your career, and someone from the media asks you, how important is your race as far as this game is concerned? For him, it's very important. It weighs on him because he has an opportunity to be the first to win a Super Bowl as a Black man, and if he loses, people will not only denigrate him, but they might denigrate his entire race. You know, Tom Brady doesn't have to bear or harbor that kind of pressure. So again, all of this goes back to a couple of things. One, why we still need to talk about history, and it also just affirms how this guy in the corner cheering his throat off um, can be motivated by someone throwing a football to again just affirm, yes, I can do great things because I see someone creating and making history right here in front of me. um, Finally, we have a long way to go. I think I've shared this slide with some of you all before. This is sort of a breakdown of engineering degrees by race. In spite of all of the tremendous progress we've made in this country, we have a long way to go in terms of how we educate people along ethnic as well as gender lines when it comes to bioengineering specifically, but really all the disciplines within science. We have we've made a lot of progress, but we have a long way to go. Here are just some books that I would encourage you, if you all get a chance to watch this later, to just jot down. And if you read even just one of these books, I think it will become clear to you that, again, even within health and science, there are still these huge disparities that exist that we have to be open and be very, very willing to have very candid conversations about if we're ever going to reduce these disparities. And when we do reduce these disparities, everybody benefits. They've done tons and tons of scientific studies that prove that. Finally, I just wanted to have you guys watch a short piece of a video of a student that's at Anschutz. And I don't know if any of you all might know this student when I play this YouTube clip. But Anschutz has done a great job with, they've created a film called Black Men in White Coats. And I'll just let you all watch this and then we can open it up for discussion. Hopefully I can open this link. Let's see. And you all tell me, with my Uncle Phil Freelon, this is him in the middle wearing the New York Yankees cap. Again, this was my first activism march on Washington for Martin Luther King birthday, but he actually ended up building the African American History Museum. He was the primary architect of that museum in Washington, D.C. I encourage all of you, when you get a chance to go see it, if you get a chance to go see it, to go at some point, maybe after this COVID craziness. But it really gives an amazing telling of the story of Black America. It goes back to, it starts in 1400 and it comes all the way to where we are now with Barack Obama. And I just wanted to close with this to say that this is me here with him he had a dream, Martin Luther King had a dream, I had a dream, and one can only achieve these dreams, and it's not unique to Black Americans. Any American can only achieve their dream when they know their history and when they identify with their history. You can't get from point A to point B unless you know what happened before point A. That's my talk, and I'll leave it for questions. And